Good afternoon. We are going to now be looking at the Victorian era, the 1800s. We have been on a long journey together, and we are on our tree. Do you see? It says 1800s fresh fruit missionary movements. And next week, we are going to combine the ripe or sweet fruit and hard fruit, 1900s and 2000 together. But for this week, we are on a very important section, very critical to understand church history. And when we look at the tree again, let's just peek at that again. The concept we're going with is the seed is Christ, the roots were the early church, then we went through the Middle Ages in the trunk, went up to the Renaissance and the Reformation, 1600s. So what's happening is the multiplication of power, beauty, creativity, civilization coming directly from God's Word, the Bible, and a group of people that grew and grew. Remember, we started actually with 12 disciples in Jesus. Now we have this church. You remember at 325 when Constantine had the Council of Nicaea and declared Christianity the religion. Do you remember that he said that, shocking to all, over 50 to 70% of the then known Roman Empire had become Christian? Now, out of that, we went out and we saw that, many things occur. But for the 1800s, it's what we would call the Great Missionary Movement. Remember, the 1600s comes right after the Protestant Reformation and the Bible, and so we had all of that creativity and people learning to read and write, civilization emerging, a much more orderly, prosperous across the board because the middle class emerged. Well, then we had the 1700s, which was so big, and that is the creation of America. Remember, Revolution, and then they had the French Revolution, and then you had this fabulous music coming, Johann Sebastian Bach, and all of the fruit of that coming directly from the Bible also. Well, the next century, this one, the 1800s, we have just the most amazing thing happening. We have in England, because the Bible has been translated now and it's in the hands of the people, common everyday people are really getting to know God. And there is a call in the Bible to go and tell others, right? That's called a missionary. Well, there was a man way up in Scotland, and you've all heard of him, and he was a young boy named David Livingstone, and he was very poor, but they were very Christian, moral, upright people. But he had to go to work at the age of 6 and sometimes work 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, and it was just really, really bad conditions. It was where they made, called the ginny, where they made thread and fabric, and it would be mind-numbing. It would be like working on a conveyor belt where you did one thing. Well, he had such a hunger and thirst for knowledge. He would bring his books with him, and there was a man nearby that was trying to teach him, and he would bring his Bible and the Latin, and he started studying, and he felt God calling him. Now that's a biography worth reading, David Livingstone. And I'll just make a long story short. He wanted to become a medical doctor, and God gave him a heart for Africa. Now, Africa was called the Dark Continent, and that's because no one had ever been to the inside of Africa. No one knew what was in the inside of Africa. You didn't have airplanes in those days. And so there was a man that had gone with his wife and their daughter, Mary, and they had gone what you would call today South Africa, and they had gone there, which is on the coast. And he had established a work there and had a beautiful home and had orange trees and had talked to native people and had won Africans to Christ. And he was very, very dedicated, very sincere man, and he was like a first. And David, though, he wanted to go to the interior of Africa. And this man, his daughter, Mary, when she became, a late teenager, early 20s, everyone said, "Oh, Mary, you need to go back to England. You're never going to find a husband out here. There are no eligible men for you." But she prayed about it and she said, "No, I feel like I should stay." And so she stayed. Now, they had been there for a long time and they knew the different languages of many of the tribes in Africa because he was doing Bible translation work to try to get a Bible into the language of the African people. So David Livingstone came and stayed with them at their home and talked to them, and they said, "Oh, you can't go to the interior. It's too dangerous." But he said, "That's where I feel God wants me to go. And if God has called me, God will protect me." So David Livingstone went in. He got a guide, a wonderful African guide. And then he got several guides. And of course they would have to go in by maybe horse or mule. That was the only way to travel in the 1800s. And then he wasn't heard from for months and months. And people were worried, and they knew about this man because he was called more than a missionary. He was called an explorer because he was going to map out Africa. Well, so finally a famous man in America named Stanley, a newspaper reporter, said, "I will go and try and find him." So that was brave also because he didn't know where he was going. So he went in and had a guide, and then he found a tent, and they said, "Yes, there's a white man in the tent," and he was ill. He had gotten malaria, and he was laying down on a couch, and in walks this man named Stanley, all dressed with the gear and everything, and there's a famous line, and he took his hand out and he goes, "Livingstone, I presume," and it was David Livingstone. So overnight, David Livingstone became this hero of the world, and he became so famous. And he was a very humble man, and he was actually mauled by a lion and lost part of the use of one of his arms. He went through a lot of suffering and really difficult times, but the Africans loved him because they knew that he loved them, and he was a medical doctor, and he could help them with their illness, and he also taught them the Bible and the way to know Jesus. And he mapped Africa, and he named the places like that. When he found the great falls, the waterfalls in the middle, he named them Victoria Falls after Queen Victoria because she was the queen in England at the time. And so when David Livingstone went back and back to the house with where Mary was, he fell in love and she fell in love. And it was a perfect match. She could help him because she knew the languages. She understood what he was doing. She also loved Africa. And so it was a match truly made in heaven. And it's a beautiful story. David Livingstone, his body is buried in Westminster Abbey. But when he died, the Africans said, no, we love him so much. They cut out his heart and buried his heart in Africa, and then his body went to England. Well, that's just the beginning of one great missionary. Then we have William Carey from Ireland, and he was a shoemaker. He taught himself languages. He was brilliant, but much of his education was self-education. And he had a call to India. And he said, I need to go to India and I need to help the people. Well, he went to India and he translated in many languages. He was a real linguist. A linguist is someone who knows many languages. He translated the scripture. He created a school. He was so famous that there's still huge monuments to him in India. There's a beautiful school named after him. And he had many trials. His wife had a very difficult time adjusting. He had that, trying to take care of her, and then trying to, be a missionary, which was very difficult. This was like being a pioneer because they didn't have anyone to follow. Because really, since the days of the apostles, you had not had missionaries going out, except for, remember, St. Columba. He sent missionaries, 2 monks at a time, across Europe. But that was in Europe and England. That was in known country. These people were going on boats across the ocean to uncharted territory. And then, of course, there's political stuff in every church or organization. And, excuse me, ooh, bless me. But they would have to fight on. And the same thing, then we had Hudson Taylor, similar story. He had a call. His parents had prayed. I think it was 2 generations had prayed for China. And here God gave him a call and he became a doctor. Well, and that's another thing. When David Livingstone became a doctor, he would have to go home and work for a year to earn money and then go to school, go back and work for a year to earn money and then go to school. It was hardship. And then when Hudson Taylor felt called to China, he said, I need to live very frugally and I will never tell anyone my needs but God. And he lived by that, and he started living on just rice. And this was in London, and he would give all his money away. He was very serious, and he collected people that wanted to go with him and went out to China and founded the famous China Inland Mission. And for those of you who know Francis Schaeffer, his wife Edith was born there. Her parents were missionaries there. And I believe that Billy Graham's wife, she was born there. Her parents were missionaries there. There are just so many, because the China Inland Mission, and he decided that he would dress like the Chinese. So he would wear a costume and had a braid and would relate to them, and was very successful because he was humble, and he was also a medical doctor and could help heal the sick. And so when I did the 1800s, I have this era could not have happened without the preceding centuries of preparation. Nothing like this had happened since the early church and the great missionary journeys of the apostles. Around the world the gospel went. At the same time, in the British Empire, you had Queen Victoria becomes queen in 1837. She's so young. She's not even 20. And she dedicates herself, and she says, when she is crowned, she said, I will be good. God gave her an understanding, and she was very Christian and very devout. God gave her beautiful Prince Albert from Germany. He was very Christian. He was very devout. And they had a wonderful marriage, and they had many children and many grandchildren. And many of you know about Queen Victoria. There's been so many documentaries and movies about her life. But it is a great life. And it is as if the fullness of time had come. And so under this reign of hers, you have China being opened by Hudson Taylor. You have Africa being opened by David Livingstone. You have India being opened by William Carey. And then you have the trade going back and forth. And without trying, this was not contrived, she becomes an empress because all these nations become part of the British Commonwealth and Canada. And it was said the sun will not set on the British Empire. And it was peace. There was no real war during her time. There were wars on the continent. And I believe that there was that, when Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote Charge of the Light Brigade, that's a very sad story. But the shores of England were not in war. They maybe had sent their men to help with countries that they had treaties with. But it was considered Pax Britannica. That means peace of Britain. And the word Britain is very interesting. In Hebrew, Britain means covenant land, and British means covenant man. Isn't that interesting? And the entire code of law that Britain has always had, the common law, is based on the biblical law of Moses. Yes, it's based on the Ten Commandments and the giving of the law. And this whole concept of innocent until proven guilty comes directly from the Bible, justice. And this is what we're seeing in the Victorian era. You had the poor, and then you had Christians raised up to help them. You had the great George Mueller, who was German, and his biography, I tell you, I've read all these biographies. Every last one of them are worth reading. George Mueller was German, and he was very hard in his heart. Even when his own mother died, he didn't show emotion. He had been very sinful and immoral, and then he went to a college and ended up, someone invited him to come to a prayer group. And he met the people, and he had never met people so loving and kind. And he became a Christian. Not just a regular Christian. He became radical. He said, I'm giving my entire life to God. What can I do for you, God? Well, he went to England, and he saw the orphans and the terrible situations. You've seen Charles Dickens movies, and you know what it was like. They didn't really have a welfare state or provision. If parents died or parents were drunkards or they couldn't take care of their children, the children were just thrown around and they were in the workhouses. And he said, I also am going to not ask anyone to help me. I'm going to pray and ask God, and I'm going to let God help me help the children. And do you know that there's so many stories. He said the orphans have to have, I think it was 3 different outfits of clothing, 2 pairs of shoes, which was a lot for those days. And he went around and told the story, and people gave offerings and gave money, and they built these beautiful kind of dormitory homes and had volunteer missionaries come to take care of the children. And they had good ventilation, they had good food, they had good education, they had good playtime and exercise, and sometimes They were right at the brink where they had no money. They'd all sit at the table, these are true stories, and pray, and a knock would come to the door, and in came the groceries. It's the most phenomenal story. Now that was George Mueller's orphanages. At the same time, you had the Salvation Army being raised up, General Booth. You know, all over there were kind of armies and nation building, like you had Italy becoming a nation, you had Germany becoming a nation, you had just had French and the Napoleonic, and then they were becoming a nation. And so General Booth, he's actually, many people believe he was part Jewish, Christian, beautiful man, and his wife, beautiful woman, and they were so dedicated to God. He said, just like John Wesley, because the church wanted to control him. They wanted to give him a little church and keep him there. He said, there's too many people that have needs. And he said, I will make the world my pulpit. And he went out and he went to the poorest places in London, and he went into even the taverns. He said, these are my people. Told them about God's love and collected resources to help them. Got them off the gin, because the gin was what was destroying the people, and got them into homes and food and clothing, just like John Wesley. Walked into squalor and filth and left behind him beauty and order. And the Salvation Army, to its credit, is still going today. At Christmas, you still put the money in the little barrel. And I read that biography. That's worth reading. Oh my goodness, I think the secret of the Salvation Army that made them successful and long-term is that when anyone would accept Christ and come to the Lord, General Booth gave them an immediate job. Within a week, they were helping someone, sweeping, cleaning, or even out on the street preaching. They would go out and preach and sing and tell the people about Jesus. And he said, we'll make it an army. And they had uniforms, and they had, ranks and order. They had the Salvation Army band. They still do. And I know people that have been in the Salvation Army and really have had wonderful lives, And then it went around the world and still is around the world. Well, that happened in this era. And then we had orphan societies, and we had, oh my goodness, reforms of the prison system and the Sunday school movement too. I talked about that last week. Raikes, R-A-I-K-E-S. That was started to teach children how to read and write and be moral and upright. Now I'm really kind of covering, I guess, England right now, but there's a lot going on in America, and there's so much. And what I was really going to start my lecture with, so I'm going to start now, was Noah Webster. And you've all heard of Noah Webster, and then you've heard of his relative, Daniel Webster. Now, these are both really important men. And I want to read something to you that I think is so fascinating. Because you see, you got to remember, we're coming right after the American Revolution in 1776, and then it's ratified, remember, in 1782, and the Continental Congress and everything's, well, Noah Webster was alive at that time. And this is what he said. He said, the United States commenced their existence under circumstances wholly novel and unexampled in the history of nations, because the American people had proclaimed their commitment to the leading political ideas of the modern age, and that was going to be self-rule. They commenced with civilization, with learning, with science, with constitutions of free government, and with the best gift of God to man, the Christian religion. Now that's Noah Webster. It is one thing, however, to proclaim principles, and quite another to embody them in a stable government. But this too, the American people achieved in 1789 with the ratification of the United States Constitution. And William Gladstone, who lived from 1809 to 1898, and there's two very important prime ministers under Victoria, William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli is actually Jewish, and he was poor, but he came up, and then he went from being a liberal to being a conservative. Gladstone was born as an aristocrat, but he was a good moral Christian man. He was a conservative, but then he embraced the liberal concept of helping the poor, which actually at that time, when you say liberal and conservative, we're using different terminology. Anyway, both men came together and really had a good unity about what they wanted to do, because so many reforms were passed under Queen Victoria, and these were her prime ministers that she worked with. Now, when William Gladstone, this is what he said about America: "I have always regarded the Constitution as the most remarkable work in modern time to have been produced by the human intellect at a single stroke, so to speak, in its application to political affairs." That's what Gladstone wrote. And people from all over the world were looking. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is what everyone wanted, but could never make happen. The reason American government worked is because it was based on a biblical foundation of self-government. You didn't have one tyrant running the show, right? Okay. Well, Noah Webster, this is what he said: "Of a government founded on its legitimate principles by the laws of nature, reason, and religion, all men are born with equal rights. Every person is equally entitled to the protection of his person, his liberty, and his property, and of course is entitled to have a voice in forming the government by which the protection is to be secured. In this country, the people all enjoy these inestimable rights and privileges, and the Constitution of the United States, formed by the delegates of the people, ratified by the people, represented in conventions, guarantees to them the enjoyment of their rights. This Constitution is truly Republican and forms a splendid era in the history of man." Now, Noah Webster had become, this is what he was considered and called. He wrote the books, history books, for the American school children. He literally was so important in all that he did. And de Tocqueville, you've always heard of him, he came and he said, every single American I met, whether it's clergy or someone on the street, a worker, a high-level person, they all said the same thing. And this is what they said. I found that most of its members seemed to, when I came to inquire into the prevailing spirit of the clergy, I found most of its members seemed to retire of their own accord. And they wanted to have the separation of religion, and it actually strengthened the religion. He said everyone I met were Christians, and they wanted America free, but they didn't want one denomination dictating. So that was what made it so great. And in 1832, the same year in which de Tocqueville spent part of his 9-month visit to America, America's greatest educator, Noah Webster, published his History of the United States. God's timing is breathtaking. Could any reasonable man doubt that history is a story written, there it is, by the finger of God? Webster's little volume, intended for the use of American youth, reads like a deliberate confirmation of de Tocqueville's assertions about Americans' belief at the time. Generations of 19th century schoolchildren would learn from Webster the origin of civil liberty. And I'm going to just read you the paragraph that starts his history book. Almost all the civil liberty now enjoyed in the world owes its origin to the principles of the Christian religion. Men began to dawn in the 16th century. There it is. This is the tree, you see? And civil liberty has been gradually advancing and improving as genuine Christianity has prevailed. By the principles of the Christian religion, we are not to understand the decisions of ecclesiastical councils, for these are the opinions of mere men, nor are we to suppose that religion to be any particular church established by law, with numerous dignitaries, living in stately palaces, arrayed in gorgeous attire, and rioting in luxury and wealth, squeezed from the scanty earnings of the laboring poor. Nor is it a religion which consists in a round of forms and in pompous rites and ceremonies. No, the religion which has introduced civil liberty is the religion of Christ and his apostles, which enjoins humility, piety, and benevolence, which acknowledges every person a brother or a sister and a citizen with equal rights. This is a genuine Christianity. To this we owe our free constitution of government. Generations of 19th century schoolchildren would learn about the character of their Puritan English and American forefathers and for the progress and enjoyment of civil and religious liberty in modern time. This is a direct quote. The world is more indebted to the Puritans in Great Britain and America than to any other body of men or to any other cause. They were not without their failings and errors. Emerging from the darkness of despotism, they did not at once see the full light of Christian liberty. Their notion of civil and religious rights were narrow and confined, and their principles and behavior perhaps too rigid. But these were the errors of the age. But they were pious and devout. They endeavored to model their conduct by the principles of the Bible and by the example of Christ and the apostles. They avoided all crimes, vices, and corrupting amusements. They read the scriptures with care. They observed the Sabbath and attended public and private worship. They rejected all ostentatious forms and rites. They were industrious in their callings and plain in their apparel. They rejected all distinctions among men, which are not warranted by the scriptures, or which are created by power or policy, to exalt one class of men over another in rights and properties. And you can get this book. Webster gave advice to the young, and that's in the last chapter of his book. This book has been reproduced. I have Advice to the Young in my library, and I think I have his whole book, but I can't read all of this, but it is so worth looking up and studying what he did. I mean, it's the heart of America, and I brought along some books to show you today. I have a collection of books that were used, early American school books, and maybe some of you have heard of the McGuffey readers, and this says on here 1837. This is the third reader. I have all of the readers upstairs, and they are based, I believe they go up 5 to 6 readers, and there's a primer, and so it goes from babies really just beginning to learn the alphabet to reading the most advanced. They even have the Greek and Hebrew Hebrew writers, Greek writers. They have very beautiful travel stories and all moral stories. Here's a story about the bear. And the rule is, they'll have a little rule: endeavor to understand what you read. No person can properly read what he does not understand. And then it tells about the black bear, but it always goes into moral lessons. And this was used for 100 years in America. And when these books were used, people could read, write, and then this was introduced, Harvey's grammar and composition. And that was also used in the early days and for almost 100 years. Grammar Part 1, elementary course. The senses. We have 5 senses: seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, and smelling. And then it goes into definitions, the sentence. It starts really, really simple, but it moves fast. And it was in a one-room schoolhouse. So if you had kids that were smart and wanted to learn, they could move fast. If kids had difficulty in learning, they could remediate and thoroughly learn. They were not pushed to just skip it over. They had to learn it. Okay, then I have another book here. This is really cool. This is Spencerian penmanship, and this was done by a man, and you can go to his home, and it's Spencer, and that's why his name is on it. And this is, okay, this is the 9 easy lessons, and they have lessons of how to sit at the desk, how to hold your pen, how to, write. And then everybody has one of these books. And it's the practice book. And this was I homeschooled. I guess this is Elizabeth's. They started with this. Just really simple. And then they put more lines. And penmanship was considered a very important subject. Well, it was when I was in school, too. We did penmanship almost every day, and I loved it. It was fun. Then I have this is a fun book, A Child's History of America. And this was Josephine Pollard. This is the 1800s. And this book is so great for beginning readers, because what they do is they divided the words up. All the syllables are divided. He rode the wind through Boston. So it's there, Boston. For sounding out words. It helps kids learn. And it's all content-oriented, moral character books. Now, this is one of the sweetest books I own. And it's reproduction, The American Schoolhouse Reader. I just want you to see some of the pictures in here. This is for the little ones. They're just learning, ball, B for ball. Let's see. There's G. There's L, Lily, see? And it's just so clean and logical, easy to understand. I've got a whole bag of books here I brought down from my library to show you. I brought you my favorite books. Okay. This is a reproduction book, and this one was done. This is in 1871. It was originally done. And this is how the history book looked. See? It's really, and it's fascinating. And some of these books, it goes quickly through, but this one starts with the Indians and the first settlers. But then this one, you have the story of liberty, and this is a very famous book, Charles Coffin. And there are two, this is 1879, and this is the story of liberty. And then this is Sweet Land of Liberty. So the story of liberty, do you know where they start? This is incredible. They start way back with John Lackland and the barons. And you know what that is? That's the Magna Carta, 1215 in England. So that's where they start. They go back to that law, and then they jump back even further, and they go back to Miriam dancing, getting freedom from Egypt, and Moses giving the law. And then this one starts with the discovery of San Salvador, and then goes on to the American. But you can't put them down when you start reading them. They're so interesting. They're so wonderful. And this is a little treasure book. I love this book. I think I might have shown it to you before. I was given this book, Every Man's History of the English Church. And this man, Percy Dearmer, D.D., Reverend, I looked him up. He wrote about 100 years ago. And what he did was he took the history for school children, and he starts with the dawn of faith, and he starts with the first Christian missionaries to Britain, and then he moves on, and there's St. Columba. Remember, that's 400s. And then he moves on, and let's see where he goes here. Occam and Marsigo, the religion of the people, Old England, change. And this is if you were to read this book and master it, you would know more than anyone knows today, because it's just so good. The Tower of London Bridge, William of Wykeham. It goes right through the Papal Schism. Now we're in the 18th century. And then we go the 19th century. And that's where we are today. It talks about the Oxford movement, which was, and here's the York Minster. It shows a picture of that. That's that great church in York we've talked about. Anyway, this is a lot of, my point is that in the 1800s, after America was created, you had schoolmen developing, and Yale and Harvard and all of those schools were developed to train the ministers. And then they branched out. They were ministerial, and in order to go to Yale, you had to know, I believe, Greek and Latin. Yes, you did. And you had to be moral and upright, and you had to declare that you were a Christian. Well, I want to keep going here. There's so much to cover. But, when we get to America, because we should talk about America, we had great movements that came out of that Methodist movement we talked of last time. We had Methodist circuit riders. John Wesley sent to America a man named Bishop Francis Asbury to establish circuits, their way, because there were so many people living out in different places. They didn't have enough churches. The circuit man would ride his horse and go to different places and preach different times. And that's why you've heard of the name Bishop Francis Asbury, and they had revival on the great frontier, because, it was pretty wild out in the Wild West, and they had a second Great Awakening. And Peter Cartwright, he was an amazing man. He was one of the circuit riding preachers, and then, he held a seat in the state legislature of Illinois. And do you know who he defeated to get that seat? A young man named Abraham Lincoln. But then Abraham Lincoln ran for the Senate, and he defeated Peter Cartwright. But Peter Cartwright was a great preacher, and he had camp meetings, and they attributed these camp meetings because they didn't have big buildings, so they'd have to have big camp meetings. The Holy Spirit moved, and then Charles Finney revivals. You've heard of Charles Finney, great revivals. And out of that came the D.L. Moody, that founded Moody Bible Institute and preached, and he had the great singer Ira Sankey that led the music, and he ended up in Chicago and had this great built, it's still going today, Moody Bible Institute. Well, then he went over to England. He was invited to England to preach, and everybody loved him. And he met with Spurgeon. Spurgeon was the great English preacher who preached to thousands of people. They called him the Prince of Preachers. And then there was a man named Billy Sunday who was a baseball player, and he was an all-American boy. And I learned something when I read his book. You know what made him so good? He was actually a runner. He was the fastest runner always with all the boys. And do you know, George Washington was always the fastest. Abe Lincoln was always the fastest. So maybe leaders have to be fast. Well, baseball, they said he had never played baseball, but because he was so fast, that's why he became this great baseball player. Well, then he had a platform and he used it for God. And you can look up Billy Sunday. That's a real fabulous. This all happened in the 1800s. And you had this, when Spurgeon preached, and he was called the Prince of Preachers in London, he actually, my grandmother, it would be my great-grandmother, went to Spurgeon's meeting and rededicated her life to the Lord. That's in my family heritage. They were Scottish descent, and they must have gone down to hear the preaching. He was so famous. He was like the Billy Graham, and he preached at the Crystal Palace. Have you ever heard of the Crystal Palace? That was what Prince Albert was, the husband of Queen Victoria, and he was an on-looking person. And he said we should have a gathering where all the people around the world bring their inventions. And it was like a World's Fair. It was called the Great Exhibition. And so for that World's Fair, he envisioned and he designed, and then they built this Crystal Palace, which was like a massive building of glass, like a big glass house, And in the Crystal Palace, they showed it was like, when you go to the World's Fair, you go and you see people came from Germany and they showed what they had invented, and then people came from Russia. It's quite fascinating. There's a movie, The Young Victoria, and there's also other movies on Queen Victoria, and they usually put part of that in. It's very interesting. Well, after the World's Fair was done, it was very successful, and it actually endeared the British people to Albert, because they thought, my, what a great man he is to do this, because it kind of put England on the map in a whole new way. Well, they had this big building, so Spurgeon was able to use it for his preaching. And people would come from all over. And my husband loves Spurgeon. Well, I do too. And you can play his sermons. We sometimes play his sermons as we go to sleep. And they're all on audio, and they're read by someone else. Of course, he wasn't recorded in his day, but tremendous move of God going on. And Billy Graham used all of these men as his model, because they would have a good singer and good, just like Martin Luther said, singing is right next to the Word of God. You had hymn writers, and you had singing, and then worship, and people participating, and then hear the sermon and make a commitment to God. It was beautiful. Well, Queen Victoria had the longest reign. Now, this queen, I think, is beating her out, but her reign was from 1837 to 1901 when she died, and she had children and grandchildren all over the world. It said that all of her grandchildren sat on the thrones of Europe. They married into other royal families. And there were many reform bills. 1832, they established representation in the House of Commons. It hadn't been that before. You had a thing called these rotten boroughs, they called, because a few wealthy people controlled them. And they said, no, we have to have representative government. So that happened. Then 1834, they passed the Poor Law, in that people would not just be handed money or charity, but they would actually create work for them. They could work for their money. Then in 1835, the Municipal Corporation Act was, which again eliminated a few wealthy people controlling one municipality. And it's from 1851 to 1914 is often called the Age of Progress. And, you know, you had the wealthy industrial people making money like on trains and steel and, you know, Carnegie and this. And then you had the aristocratic landowners having money. Well, they came together and they had an agreement. They wanted to control the political thing. But you know what? It wasn't right, because it would mean that the average working man didn't have anything, wouldn't have any say in the government. So there's a thing called the Chartist movement. And it has an entire, there are 12 points to that I could read to you. And I don't know if we want to take the time to read all of it, because it's quite long. But I'll read a couple, and then you will see that how it goes along with giving freedom to the individual. And that's what God does. The charter called for universal manhood suffrage. That meant no slavery for any man. The secret ballot, voting districts of equal population to give equal representation in Parliament. Abolition of property ownership as a prerequisite for serving in Parliament. 5. Payment of members of Parliament so that ordinary people could afford to serve in the House of Commons. 6. Annual elections of Parliament so that members would frequently answer to the voters for their deeds. And they almost passed all of those charters, and that really changed and gave the common man more say. Then there was the Anti-Corn Law League, and that comes out in a lot of the Victorian movies, because that was why, you know, you had that terrible potato crisis and starvation in Ireland, because they had established these laws of trade, and when they didn't work, the trade stopped and people were starving, and so they changed that, and that was called the Corn Laws. And that was a very good thing under Victoria. And we talked about George Mueller, William Booth. The YMCA was established. Florence Nightingale, she established her whole level of nursing. Christian medical care. Dunant established the Red Cross. That came right out of a Christian vision of helping people. Clara Barton, during, you know, the Civil War, she helped, and that's another issue we didn't get into, but there was the Civil War, of course, in America, and that was tragic, and yet it did bring freedom. So it, you know, it has both sides to it. But then we, of course, had there's a man named Gypsy Smith, and he was one of the 1860 to 1941. I read his biography. That is a fascinating. He was British. He was a young boy, and his father and his uncle found the Lord, and they became extremely devout and dedicated, and yet they still lived as gypsies in the little caravan. And he describes it that gypsies have to move. They were clean, good people, but he fell in love with Jesus, and he wrote beautiful songs, and he became an evangelist. And he became a very famous evangelist and traveled all over America, worked with the Salvation Army for quite a long time, and got training from General Booth. And you know, C.T. Studd is another man. if you want to read a biography that will change your life, C.T. Studd, he was a famous cricketer. He and his brothers, there were 3 brothers, and they went to Cambridge, and they were on the cricket team, and they were the champions, and they were famous, and their father was very wealthy. Well, their father had gotten stuck in Ireland. The boat wasn't going. He was a businessman. And so he thought, oh, I'll just go to that meeting. It was D.L. Moody preaching. So he went to the meeting, and the boat still wasn't going. So he went back to the meeting the next night. And then he went about 4 nights in a row. Finally, he was so moved by the Holy Spirit, he gave his life to Christ. And do you know that that man only lived 2 more years, and he was middle-aged, but it is said that he did more in 2 years than most people would ever do in their whole life. He went home, and in the book of C.T. Studd are pictures. He turned his beautiful estate into a spiritual center and started having meetings, started praying for his sons, and all 3 sons gave their lives to God. And C.T. Studd, the one son, was so devout and so dedicated. He said, I want to go to India, China, and Africa. He wanted to go everywhere and preach the gospel and become a missionary. Well, he did. That's what's amazing. He did. And he met his wife. And his wife also was from an aristocratic background, and she had found the Lord through the Salvation Army. And she had dedicated her life, and so they met on a mission, got married, and C.T. said, now, you know, he had a big inheritance that came when his father died. He says, but you know what? I don't want to keep my part. I'll keep part for you, his wife, because I don't want you to be without money, but I want to give mine to God. He gave his whole inheritance to the Salvation Army, D.L. Moody, and helped build the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and Hudson Taylor. And when he went to Hudson Taylor from China, Hudson Taylor goes, you know, you better pray about this. I don't know if I should take this. And C.T. Studd said, please take it. And then they have a beautiful story how God provided. His wife said, I will not be outdone by you, and she gave hers away. So then they're totally on faith. They had 3 beautiful daughters. And he said, God provided all that we needed. They had the best education. They married beautiful, wonderful Christian men. And the story is just phenomenal. And in the book, at the end of C.T. Studd's life, here he's this aristocratic British man, trained at Cambridge, trained to live a life of, you know, incredible life. He's sitting in a little tent, and I think it's in Africa. And he said, and then right next to it is a picture of his big house, the big mansion. And he said, I'm the happiest man on earth. I love God, and God loves me. And he was the happiest man on earth. I thought, what a story. Well, C.T. Studd, because of his cricketeering, he was famous as an athlete. He would go to the YMCA and give messages. That was part of his when he was young. And the YMCA was raised up as a true born-again Christian organization. All of this happened in the 1800s, the Victorian era. And you know, I'm having a little cup of tea. I thought, I can't get through I'm so cold today, it's snowing. And I thought, you know what? This is to the Victorian era. I don't think we would be having this tea without the Victorian era. It was so established that tea was where it was everything social. It became affordable for the common man. Remember when we learned that in 1700s it became so expensive, or it was so expensive, that only the wealthy could have the tea, and then they would add a little bit. The leftover tea leaves would go then to the servants. The servants would grab them. And then after they made tea with that, it would be flung out, and that would go to the common poor people. And tea became so expensive. But in Victoria's time, because of the trade with China and India, the tea became very affordable. And it was the perfect drink for the Christian, because this is what the Salvation Army, General Booth said, if I can get these people off their gin, they can have good lives. And so he gave them tea, and they became teetotalers, just like that was what happened with Charles and John Wesley too. Well, I've covered a big century, but you know, there was a lot of other beautiful things going on also. A lot of poetry, a lot of great writers. Charles Dickens wrote all those books, and they really have a Christian theme. He always puts Christmas in his books, and he always, good triumphs over evil, and he tells the story of the poor to move your heart, to help people. Then you have Sir Walter Scott in Scotland, and he wrote all the beautiful books, and he is such a good Christian. And my great uncle Peter Hendry was the butler at Sir Walter Scott's estate in the middle of the 1800s. So I don't think Sir Walter Scott would have been alive at the time, but he was at that point, the estate still is there, and it is still going. And then you have, oh my goodness, Alfred Lord Tennyson writing in England the beautiful poems. And in America, you have all of the wonderful poets, Nathaniel Hawthorne. And I can't even start listing them because I'm going to leave people out. But, you know, you have Longfellow and Emerson and, oh my goodness, Walt Whitman, and then all the great writers of novels and books. And, you know, Sir Walter Scott started what you would call the historical novel. As a young boy, he was told stories by had a lame leg, and he was sickly, and he had to go live with his grandparents, and his grandmother would tell him the border tales of Scotland, and he put them all in the Waverley novels and told all the stories. And do you know, really, his books revived Scottish pride and the kilt and the plaid, and so much of the lore had been kind of lost, and it all came back through his writing. And he had admired Jane Austen back in the 17s. Nothing happens in a vacuum. He had also admired the beautiful woman who wrote The Scottish Chiefs. And that was a great book. And that was 17, however. But then he's the beginning of the Victorian and all the writers. And then you have the Romantic writers, you know, Percy and Keats and Shelley and Lord Byron, and it goes on, and just this proliferation of writing in England and in America. Well, it's been so wonderful to be with you, and next time we're going to go into the 1900s, and then we're going to combine that together with the 2000s, since there are only so far 21 years. So I am sending you out more resources. Please look at them when you have time. I hope this has been enjoyable for you. And I love the Victorian era. It's a wonderful era of family, father and mother in the home with the children. And you know, I'm wearing a cameo today. And cameos, I have one cameo earring too. Cameos came really big in the Victorian era, and that's why I wore this lace collar with the cameo, because cameos originate, remember Florence and the Renaissance in Italy? They originate in Italy. The Victorians loved color, life, beauty, and so they loved their cameos, and cameos became really, really popular. Lace became popular. And Queen Victoria, you know, she was such a young, beautiful queen, and then she lived to be so old. You see pictures of her in black, but that's when her husband Albert died, and she never took black off. But when she's young, there was a lot of vibrancy there in the family, and inspired others. You know, a lot of color. So let us inspire others. And I want you to take from this lecture the importance of Christian biography. And you can find them at Bible bookstores or online. Christianbooks.com have a lot of good resources, and even the children's Christian biographies written for younger people are very helpful, very informative. You read the book quickly, but covers a lot of ground. So, and I would encourage you to get them for your children, because we all need heroes, don't we? Yes, we need people to look up to. And I have always looked up to Queen Victoria. In fact, that was where I gave my original, when I was at the University of Washington and I did my history degree originally, I was doing a specialty in Victorian England. And as a final here, I want to show you a picture. I'm going to try and copy this and send it to you. This is my favorite picture of her. It's Queen Victoria presenting a Bible to a visiting African prince. And the story goes that the prince asked her, "What makes the kingdom of England so great? What makes you so great?" And she handed him the Bible and said, "This is the book that will make you great. Go and read it." Isn't that beautiful? And that's Albert behind her. She understood it was the Bible that gave all the greatness to her kingdom. So with that final note, I say, God bless each one of you. I appreciate you. I pray for you that your studies will be bright and happy. Okay, God bless.